Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. This is an awesome turnout. Give yourselves a round of applause this morning. Yeah. Come on, y'all can do better than that. Come on. On a Monday morning, right? And a morning where the university is technically closed. And so I want to thank you all for being here and responding to this call. And so we're going to get started with our program this morning. And so I first want to introduce Kat Kelman, who is the Director of the Center for Inclusion, Diversity Education, and Advocacy. And so please welcome Kat Kelman as she comes to welcome us.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone feeling? All right, excited? Did you tweet about where you are today this morning? Did you Facebook someone? Instagram? So if you have your phone now, I ask that you right now either tweet that you're sitting in this room right now, or you put something on the ground, because you're giving back to your community today. You could be sleeping, correct? Right? But you're giving back, which is his dream, right? He didn't sleep on his dream. He woke up, he got up in that morning, and he kept on walking, correct? So that's what you all are doing. So I just want, on behalf of the Division of Student Affairs and Enrollment Management, I really want to welcome you to our annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Diversity Address and Day of Service, as well as our kickoff to our second annual Social Justice Week here at Florida Atlantic University On your tables and throughout today, you'll see the lineup for this week. We ask that you please take a picture of it. We would love to see you at some more events throughout the week. We have some great things planned, especially one of those that many of you in this room will be helping put together, which is tunnel vision. So we ask that, especially if you're working on tunnel vision, that you come back and see what your work has really done to impact people's day and really understand what it means to walk in the ideas of privilege, power, and oppression. And then the additional services that we have. I'd like to thank our sponsors today, the Center for Ideas, the Student Activities and Involvement Office, the Diversity Platform, Student Government, Multicultural Programming Board, and Student Advocating and Volunteer Involvement, SAVVY. We are gathering this morning to acknowledge and critically think on the challenging and impact of the work and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let us be mindful that this address is designed to stimulate respectful and meaningful dialogue. We hope that you will be open to receiving the message of commitment to addressing the issues of social inequality and injustice through activism, advocacy, and allyship. We should know that Dr. Martin Luther King possibly would have celebrated his 91st birthday on this past Wednesday, January 15th. The empowering and enlightened passion that this drum major approach to his work should still spark the fire in each of us, not only to follow his lead, but also to blaze new trails and establish new trends and technologies towards more socially and global society. I just want to say, I don't get to close this event, I only get to open it, but I really want to say thank you to all of our students today, but also any of our SAME leadership. So if you are SAME leadership, raise your hand. That's you, Dr. Fairman. So our interim vice president for student affairs is over there. So he's also giving up his time to be here and listen to our address. And then any of our student affairs and enrollment management staff, if you could raise your hand. Thank you all for coming this morning. So just like you all are here, they are here listening to our awesome address, but also giving up their time to give service. So it's not just that we ask our students to be here, we have staff that are also committed to the dream. And so I'm gonna introduce David to continue the rest of our program.
Thank you, Cam. I didn't take the time. So I am David Bynes. I serve as the Assistant Director for Diversity Education and Training within the Center for Ideas. And so again, welcome this morning. Lauren Perkins is a senior from Pembroke Pines, Florida, and will graduate in May of 2020 with her degree in English and a minor in commercial music. Lauren is also a spoken word artist, a performer, a singer-songwriter, and the founder of One Mic, a spoken word student organization at Florida Atlantic University. Will you please put your hands together and welcome with me Ms. Lauren Perkins as she comes.
I am the new black. I am the new black that sharply sought the face that society has created on African Americans. I am the new black that points a gun, index finger on the trigger, in the mouth of the word bigotry. Eyes blurred from rage, all I see is red like the blood Jesus shed on Friday, Black Friday, the day I proclaimed the streets would not be congested with dead bodies over a box of LeBrons, but yet I dream a dream like Martin Luther King that we shall live in peace and harmony. For I am the new black that doesn't have to smoke on coral reefs to get to an extraterrestrial high. We're so busy worshiping stars on earth that they believe that they're God. For I am the new black. I am the new black that didn't come here to shed death, but life. I am the new black that came here to shed not darkness, but light. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and for whosoever believeth in him shall not perish. But yet the young want to scream out in the streets, we're gonna die young. Young blood spilleth out the cup because someone didn't pass the prune broccoli. Now, I don't need to be blunt, but y'all playing with these people's lives like it's Monopoly. One minute you're winning, then the next you go bankrupt. Y'all living for the moment, but I'm gonna stack up inside a trust fund. For I am the new black. We would rather sell our souls to get eyebrows like Beyonce, and our daughters are no longer wives, but lower than a D-base dime. For I am the new black. And I'm not here quick to point my finger at my brothers and my sisters, but I pointed at myself, for I am the new black. It's not a fashion statement, but a movement. Thank you.
Dr. Tamika Hobbs is a graduate of Florida A&M University and Florida State University, where she earned her doctoral degree in United States history and historical administration and public history. She has taught courses in American and African American oral history and public history at Florida A&M University, Virginia State in Petersburg, Virginia, and John Tyler Community College in Chester, Virginia. In addition to her teaching experience, she has served as a researcher, writer, consultant, and director for a number of public and oral history projects in Florida and Virginia, including the African American Trailblazers in Virginia History Program, a statewide educational program focused on celebrating African American history. Her professional experience includes serving as director of projects and programs for the John G. Riley Museum and Center of African American History and Culture, located in Tallahassee, Florida. Dr. Hobbs has also worked as a program and education manager for the Library of Virginia, where she coordinated the African American Trailblazers in Virginia History Program, a statewide educational program celebrating African American history. In 2011, she authored a children's book about the Library of Virginia entitled To Collect, Protect, Serve, Behind the Scenes and the Library at the Library of Virginia. She joined the faculty at Florida Memorial University in Miami Gardens, Florida in August of 2011 and currently serves as the Associate Provost for Academic Affairs. Additionally, she is the author of the book Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence and in Florida, which was published in August of 2015 by the University Press of Florida. FAU, please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Dr. Tamika Bradley Hobbs as she comes with our keynote this evening.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction and for the invitation to be here this morning. Good morning. Good morning. Wow, it's like 8:30. Y'all are bright-eyed and ready to go. Congratulations to you. Again, it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. I would like to recognize and thank the Idea Center for this fantastic occasion. I am tremendously impressed that this is your second Social Justice Week, right? How many of you participated before? There's a few of you who are returning, but it is really impressive that you would take that on, that for a day that many see as a holiday, a day to sleep in, a day to rest. You're here uplifting the mission, the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And so I just want to acknowledge that and acknowledge your efforts. I'd also like to thank Kat Kelman, who we heard from earlier today. Thank you for all your hard work and all of the staff who made this occasion possible. It is very, very delightful to be here on what would have been the 91st birthday. This past Wednesday, as has already been pointed out, would have been the 91st birthday of Dr. King. And we come each year on this day, federal holiday. Very few that are dedicated to private citizens, but it speaks to the impact of the man that we come here to honor. Not many Americans have changed as dramatically as Dr. King has been responsible for the trajectory of this American experience. And part of what I like to do on a day like today is to try to make meaning of that man, Dr. King, of his life and of his legacy. And there are a few things that rise to the top of my mind when I think about Dr. King. Number one, I think about his bravery. I think about his sacrifice. And I also think about him as a truth teller, someone who was willing to examine critically the country that he called home and ask for it to do more, to do better, to work towards becoming that more perfect union. And he did so at sacrifice. When I think about the willingness, his willingness to criticize America, I think about another great critic of the United States. His name was James Baldwin. And one of my favorite quotes from Mr. Baldwin has to do with his love for America. And he said, "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." Right? This connection between love of country and correction of country, pointing out a larger vision for where we still need to go. Beyond what Dr. King said, it was also the way in which he said it, right? He was one of perhaps the best orators that came to us out of the 20th century. When you think about his words, it was a reflection of both his polished intellect and his deep roots in the American Baptist church. The African American Baptist sermonic tradition is what he built upon to give us not only this vision, but to inspire people to move forward with their action and their activism. And as we come thinking about all of these wonderful things, this great legacy of Dr. King, we cannot separate it from the tragic end of his life. This year, a few months down the road in April, we will recognize the 52nd anniversary of his tragic assassination. So on this day, not only do we come to celebrate, but for many perhaps like me, you come to mourn. This is a somber realization when we think about both the possibilities and the limits of growth and change in our society. There is, in the story of Dr. King, this dueling nature of both the American dream and the American nightmare. I sometimes think about this in the context of the life of Christ. We saw him come as a messianic figure to inspire people to do well, to perform miracles. When I think about Dr. King, it is in fact a miracle when you look at the transition in the society that was brought by the civil rights movement. I think about the stories of Jesus in the temple turning over tables, right, causing a ruckus. King did just that when he criticized American militarism and came out against the Vietnam War. It was a disruption. And it was something that ultimately made him a target and made him a martyr. He paid a very high price for his willingness to speak truth to power. And though we are talking about King in this context, I also, when I come to these celebrations, think much broadly, because he was one of a number of people who, number one, lost their lives. When we think about Malcolm X, when we think about Medgar Evers here in the state of Florida, Harry Tyson Moore and his wife, Harriet B. Moore. The names go on and on. We were going to list all of the people who lost their lives in this fight to make America better, to create the world that I am able to enjoy. And so we also are obliged to remember those who paid with their lives. So that's the one hand, those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. The other side of this is recognizing all of those people who were contemporaries of Dr. King, who gave effort, large, small, and between, to advance the cause of this American Revolution that we now recognize as the Civil Rights Movement. It resulted in a seismic shift in American society. We have to appreciate and recognize. When I talk about his contemporaries, I'm talking about men like Andrew Young, Ralph Abernathy, Hosea Williams, James Bevel, Ella Baker, Baynard Rustin, Constance Baker Motley, Diane Nash, John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, Joanne Robinson, the Reverend Edward T. Graham here in Miami in South Florida, Virgil Hawkins, W. George Allen, who we just lost recently, Dr. Robert Haling, Eula Johnson, Dr. Vaughn Mizell. And these are just a few of the names of individuals who challenged the barriers in our society, who found the cracks within them, and who pushed through them in order to make it better for the generations who were coming behind them. And all of their actions, great or small, taken together, created a revolution in America. And I want to emphasize that part, because sometimes we get intimidated, right? Everybody can't be Dr. King, but everyone has a role to play. And when we think about King and the struggle, realize that he would not have been able to achieve the greatness that he achieved had it not been for all the foot soldiers, for everybody who stood with him and did whatever they could. You know, it may not have been someone who organized the bus boycott, but the person who strapped up their shoes, put on a poncho to walk to work every day, even when it rained, in order to support that bus boycott. They need credit for the work that they did. There is room for everyone. All of the effort matters when you're trying to undertake the shift that we've seen in the civil rights movement, and that's a lesson for us today. Also, the bravery that it took to stand in the face of attack, to be persecuted. People during this time period lived with a very real threat of lynching, that they could lose their lives for what they were doing. So that too is a lesson for us. It is no small thing. And for me, when I come to the MLK holiday each year, I come with gratitude in my heart for the many sacrifices, for the opportunities that were created and that I and you are able to enjoy today. The world that I inherited is dramatically different from the one that my parents lived in, from the one that their parents lived in, so on and so forth. And it all has to do with the legacy and impact of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. It's personal for me, and this is something that I like to share frequently whenever I have the opportunity. My brother and I are the first people in our family never to have attended segregated schools. And it's an interesting fact, because I think what we tend to do in our society is we try to fossilize the civil rights movement. Those are black and white pictures, happened a really long time ago. But when you look at not only, there is the reality, there's the law, but what it took to actually put that law into action. It took another 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education to achieve the reality of school integration, right? And when we talk about the impact, we're just beginning to reap the harvest of the civil rights movement. I and my brother are the first ones to never attend a segregated school. We've had opportunities. And the opportunities that I've been able to enjoy, the achievement that I've been able to enjoy, it's good. But I also have to realize that I'm not the first person that could have done it in my family, but for the opportunities that I've had, right? So it's important that we recognize that, especially for people who will still say to us, why do we keep talking about race? Why do we keep talking about the past? We talk about it because it has real impact and real legacy. As excited as I may want to get about some of the things that folks in my generation are doing, I'm left with all of these what ifs, right? What might my life have been like if my grandfather hadn't gotten all the promotions that he deserved on his job and was not overlooked, and instead asked to train the young white men who would ultimately become his supervisors and his bosses? What would that additional income that he would have earned have meant for my family, for the educational opportunities for my mother? What if my mother, when she was leaving high school, had a guidance counselor who could really look at her and look beyond the color of her skin and see her potential and encourage her towards higher education? That didn't happen for my mother because of the racism that was a part of what she dealt with. So it's important for us to recognize that. It's important for, as I said, to have this chronology that centers where we really are. It's important for us to realize that as you go through your daily walks, some of the people that you encounter, particularly if they're African American, live through this era and are still bearing some of the trauma, dealing with some of the leftover residue of what they experienced during what was a quite revolutionary period in our history. The other reason I think it's important to shed light on this is to understand structural racism, and that's what we're talking about, right? And that's something that I want to leave with you today in my remarks. We have to think about the damage, we have to think about the impact and what it means in the lives of people. And I talk about education here, but that's just one of the many areas in which we've seen advancement in American society. And I'm forever grateful, because the difference in my life was the difference of Dr. King and the difference of that generation. My life would be completely different if it had not have been for that. So I come back to the idea of today as a day of gratitude. I love the t-shirt. Some of you have probably seen it. It says, "I am my ancestors' wildest dreams," right? I love that phrase because it is a reminder of not only the gratitude, but the obligation that I hold. It is a comforting and a motivating idea. There's striving in that idea. There's obligation in that thought. And obligation is a little bit of what I want to come to talk to you about today. It's what came to mind as I thought about today's theme, actualizing the dream through activism. And it brought a question to my mind. What is it that we owe to Dr. King and his contemporaries for the great sacrifices that they made? What do we owe the dream? And the answer in part is actualizing those dreams. So when we talk about actualizing, what we're actually doing is talking about making an idea real. But in order to do that, you have to have power to make any idea, any concept a reality. If you're going to be able to take something from theory to practice, take a dream and make it a reality, you have to have the power to be able to do it. Actualization then is about achieving the power necessary to manifest the dream, to manifest the vision. And one way that power can be achieved, especially by the disempowered, is through activism, which is a core part of the theme today, core part of the work that you're going to go out and do today. We are the inheritors of the dream, of King's dream, of his hopes for this nation, which were at their core representative of the fulfillment of the promises in the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, as well as our professed Judeo-Christian values. There is so much of this in King's most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech, when he talks about America not just as it was, but this vision of what America could be. It is why that speech resonates with us even today, why Dr. King is such a valuable American treasure. But before we move to this activism, before we get ready to act, we have to be crystal clear about what the dream actually is. And we can do this in a number of ways. I think in the first line, we can look at what needs to be done to protect the dream, as Dr. King articulated, as he worked for and achieved during his lifetime. What do we need to do to keep those things in place? And then secondly, asking ourselves, what part of that vision, what part of King's dream remains unfulfilled? And I think that there are some very really specific things that we can do when it comes to that. In preparation for my comments today, I went back and reread a book that was published in 1967. It was the year before King was killed. It was his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And if you haven't read that, I encourage you to do so, because what you're going to find is a man taken from us far too soon, someone who is reflecting on the decades' work of his life, having come through the Civil Rights Movement. We've seen the Civil Rights Act been passed by that point. We've seen the Voting Rights Act been passed by that point. So he's sitting back, though, and he's looking out across this vast landscape of America and assessing not only the distance that they've come, he's critiquing the movement, he's critiquing the leadership, but in that book, he's also pointing a way forward. And it's very interesting because we like to freeze Dr. King. That's you. We really like to freeze Dr. King in 1963, right? In this very hopeful poise at Washington, D.C. But what you have to realize is that by the end of his life, Dr. King was really, again, picking up with a new critique and a new vision for America. That yes, we've done some things right, but there was so much more for us to do. And it's going to be in that book that we see some of the articulation of that vision. And those are some of the things that I want to talk to you about. Today, I would like to leave these with you. You know, what is the work that we still need to do? And there are 3 points that I'd like to share that I think are a part of us being able to actualize the dream of Dr. King. The first thing we need to do is to actualize the unfettered access to the ballot for all people. We need to secure voting rights for folks. One of the biggest triumphs of Dr. King's career, he would believe, he wrote about, was what happened after Selma with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And you have to understand a little bit about Black history and this culture to really be able to appreciate it, right? Because originally, Black men were given the right to vote in 1870 with the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. But there was nearly a century of active resistance to Black political participation in this country that was only, rolled back when we got the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so that has been a definitive point of progress in our society. But I have to tell you, in the recent years, there have been very direct efforts. There have been very successful threats to the ability of African Americans to exercise their right to vote in this country. We've seen the gutting of the provision in the Voting Rights Act that would allow for federal intervention. And once that has been rolled back, we've seen ID laws and all these other things come along to erode further. There are states that have been just absolutely egregious when it comes to preventing African Americans from using the right to vote. Here in the state of Florida, what's happening with voting rights here in the state of Florida? We had a pretty tremendous breakthrough back in 2018, right, with the Amendment 4. That was huge. But we've since then seen resistance, right? There's a law that's been put into place that says that in order for those returning citizens to be able to exercise their right to vote, they have to pay all of their fines. It is just a new shenanigan, right, that is meant to hit this population exactly where they're most vulnerable, right? If you've just come out of prison, you are trying to reestablish your work, your income. You probably don't have the money to pay those fines, but they put up yet another hurdle between the citizen and the right to vote. So when we talk about the work that still needs to be done, there's a lot that's left to do in that arena. Also, as we go into this election year, I want to harken back to a little bit of Florida history. This November will not only be the time of our next major election, but it is also the century anniversary, 100 years since the massacre that took place in Ocoee. Show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the town of Ocoee and what happened there in 1920? I see one hand. It's an important piece, two hands. It's an important piece of history of Florida. It was in this election in 1920 when African Americans attempted to exercise their right to vote. And I should back up and say that leading up to the election, there was a massive effort on the part of the KKK in the state of Florida to intimidate, to prevent African Americans from exercising their right to vote, because there was something else that was really significant in 1920 that is an anniversary this year. That election in 1920 was the first time that Black women would have had the right to vote, right? So there was a real fear of the power of not only the Black male as a voter, but now the Black woman as a voter. And people who understand democracy understand that voting is the most basic form of activism and can result in a huge shift in where power resides. And so these white supremacists were adamant that that wouldn't happen and had sent threats to Blacks in major cities, especially throughout the state. But in Ocoee, when these Black men, these Black veterans of World War I, insisted on their right to vote, it resulted in a pogrom that destroyed an entire African American community and decimated. There were no more Black residents in the city of Ocoee after this election, all because Black people tried to exercise their right to vote. So it's a very important story for us to remember because our state has this legacy. But when we talk about the importance of voting, don't take it lightly. It is one of the most fundamental forms of activism in our democratic society, and you gotta dig in. Encourage yourselves, encourage everyone around you to make sure that you're taking advantage of it because it is a part of King's dream. That was the first point. The second point, second area where we still need some actualization is around the end of racism and racial bias in society. Can't beat that drum enough. King's vision was only radical because it challenged the nation's historic acquiescence to and participation in systemic racism and the values of white supremacy, which are much a part of this nation's heritage and ethos as any other part that we hold dear. And while we as a nation have made great strides against racism and anti-Blackness in particular, we have become demonstrably more inclusive, more equitable. There is still a danger. There's a danger that we could be satisfied with changing only the surface and not the core, allowing a few people of color, LGBTQ people to sit at the table while there are millions who are still left out. We can't simply be satisfied with checking the boxes of diversity, equity, and inclusion while consistently demonstrating an unwillingness to routinely perform the foundational work necessary for a cultural shift that really and truly shares both power and resources with those who've been historically underrepresented. And I'll quote here from Dr. King in that book that I referenced, Where Do We Go From Here? And what he has to say about this, because he witnessed it even in his lifetime. Loose and easy language about equality, resonant resolutions about brotherhood fall pleasantly on the ear, but for the Negro, there is a credibility gap he cannot overlook. He remembers that with each modest advance of the white population, remembers that with each modest advance, the white population promptly raises the argument that the Negro has come far enough. Each step forward accents the ever-present tendency to backlash. So what he's saying is that, yes, we make progress, but you keep seeing people who will put up their hand and say, that's enough. We don't want you to go any further. That there are limits to the levels of which we will allow whatever oppressed group, in this case African Americans, but we can add many others to the list, there are limits to which we allow you to rise. Ultimately, the goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion is not for these disempowered groups to be siloed or patronized. The goal is to achieve true freedom, which most especially from the myriad of ways that implicit bias limits and hampers and warps human interactions at every level, reinforcing difference and resulting in exclusion and ultimately continuing acts of oppression. So when we talk about making sure that the least of those are heard and that we're working for the inclusion and the success of every individual, it is very important. And I want to come back to, I think in our society, given our history, last year marked the 400th anniversary of the first time on record that we know that Africans were brought to these shores and made available to sail. Anti-Blackness is one of the fundamental justice issues in our country, and it's something that we still wrestle with. And it is, in my opinion, why groups like Black Lives Matter, movements like Black Lives Matter, are so vitally important in the work that they're trying to do. Here in the state of Florida, we saw the founding of the Dream Defenders back in 2012. They too are the embodiment, the folks who are keeping the pulse of Dr. King's dream moving forward. Had the pleasure of working with the South Florida people of color. That's actually where I met David in one of our programs. We do what we can as a community group to create opportunities for people to come together, to read together, to watch films together, to talk together, to learn about the biases that we all carry in us and to work on overcoming them. Though those items, those pieces are very important towards advancement. You ought to be paying attention to folks like Ibram X. Kendi. How many of you have heard of him? Ibram Kendi. New York Times bestseller. We had the privilege of hosting him at Florida Memorial University in November, but he's the author of a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And if you haven't read that book, I'm going to encourage you to do so, because if we're talking about taking action, education, improving yourself, improving your outlook, improving your lens is action. And what he writes about in that book is incredibly powerful. He and other scholars like Robin DiAngelo, anybody heard of her? Somebody else that you should be paying attention to. They talk about this concept of active anti-racism. And it is the new frontier, in my mind, of how we're going to crack this racist thing and keep moving forward. The idea that it's not good enough for you to sit quietly and say, I'm not a racist. I'm not doing anything racist. I'm not calling anybody names. I'm not standing in anybody's way. That while that may be good and it may make you feel good, it falls short because there is work that needs to be done to end racism. And so what they push people to is this posture of active anti-racism. That only the work against racism is how you get the claim to be an anti-racist. It is a profound idea, and I think it's something that has the potential to continue this revolution in American society that we so badly need. So the first was fighting for voting rights, making sure that everyone has access. The second point was continuing to work against racism and racial biases in American society. The last place that I want to leave has to do with the work that Dr. King was involved in before he was tragically assassinated 52 years ago, and that is a focus on ending poverty in America. It was in that year, in the closing years of his life, that Dr. King was spearheading what was then called the Poor People's Campaign. How many of you have heard of that before? Okay, a few of you. Well, just a few years ago, on the 50th anniversary of his assassination, Reverend William Barber and a group of other leaders from around the country reinstituted King's Poor People Campaign to address the needs of the people in this country who are the most vulnerable. And it was something that was very specific. In King's time, he just found it incredibly difficult to reconcile the amount of wealth, number one, that was in this country, this great country, one of the, still then and now, a powerhouse on the global scale. That not only did we have all this wealth, but we were choosing to use significant portions of that money to fund war. During that time as the war in Vietnam. All the while, there were millions of Americans who were suffering, parents who couldn't feed their children, not enough jobs, not enough housing, and in Dr. King's moral view, that was a huge failing in this country. And so he began to mobilize people. This Poor People Campaign took groups out of Mississippi and marched them up to camp in the nation's capital to demonstrate the shame of America, if you will, and it's going to be kind of in the midst of that energy and in the midst of this multiracial movement. And that was what was incredibly powerful about this new direction for Dr. King, that he wasn't solely focused on Black folks. Poverty, exclusion is something that affects all people. And he was on the verge of bringing together what could have been, again, quite a revolutionary multiracial group to challenge American government in a very particular way. But today, Reverend Barber and others have revived this campaign, and they're working to address this issue. And the need is great. I was doing some research for this just to kind of quantify in my remarks today what we're dealing with. In this country, we have 140 million people who are living in poverty. In the state of Florida, 51% of Floridians are classed either as poor or low income. That was really stunning to me. And of those, there are 2.5 million children in Florida growing up in poverty. About that same number, 2.5 million Floridians are uninsured. And if you've ever had to live without health insurance, you know how difficult that can be. When we talk about wealth inequality, which is really huge as well, what you can see statistically in Florida is that between 1970 and 2012, that the income for the top 1% grew 176%, while the income for the bottom 99 fell by 12%, right? Nothing wrong with getting money. Wealth is not, equivalent to villainy, but what are we doing for everyone, right? That's part of King's moral vision, that we have to be inclusive of everyone. And we're starting to see some of these ideas bubble up even in the 2020 presidential campaign. Andrew Yang has proposed what he called the freedom dividend, which is a universal basic income for everyone. Where did he get that idea from? In part from Dr. King. It was something that he wrote about. It was something that he advocated in his work. Michael Bloomberg just yesterday made an announcement of his Greenwood Initiative, named for yet another disastrous race riot. That's this time in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that destroyed a Black business district. But he went to that site, went to Tulsa, Oklahoma yesterday, and announced his plan to do something about the tremendous racial wealth gap that exists in this country. because it is quite tremendous. It is a legacy of this unequal opportunity. For every, the average, black, excuse me, the way to phrase it is that the average white household in America has 19 times the wealth of the average white household. And that is not very reflective of effort. It is directly reflective of those 400 years of oppression that I referenced earlier today. And Mike Bloomberg has put that squarely on the table as a part of his presidential campaign. So very interesting development, but again, if we're talking about how we can move the dream of Dr. King forward, this is a very important area. So with that, as I conclude today, I want to congratulate you on your decision to serve the community on this day of service and during this week of social justice here at Florida Atlantic University. I am applauding you for embracing the opportunity to continue the dream, to activate the dream in the work that you will perform today. And if there's anything that I could say to you, that I could leave with you, it would be to encourage you to extend this energy of service beyond just today, and that you seek to involve yourself deeply in some movement important to you that will help to bring about the dream about which King wrote, about which Dr. King spoke. I encourage you to use the talents, the skill, the knowledge that you are acquiring as a part of your education to move the needle forward for everyone, to make room for everyone. Your education is a privilege. Consider how you will use it in the service of others. And I'll leave you with a quote, again from Where Do We Go From Here, from Dr. King. And what he said is, "It is enormously difficult for any oppressed people even to arrive at an awareness of their latent strengths. They are not only buffeted by defeats, but they have been schooled assiduously to believe in their lack of capacity. People struggling from the depths of society have not been equipped with knowledge of the science of social change. Only when they break out of the fog of self-denigration can they begin to discover the forms of action that influence events. I encourage you to use your education to help break the fog. I encourage you to use your talents, your strength, and your resources to help activate the dream." With that, thank you very much. And I wish you a good day.
Dr. Hobbs, thank you so much. We have a brief amount of time for some questions, and so Dr. Hobbs is open to it. We will open a brief period of Q&A, and so Dr. Hobbs has supplanted so much in that talk, and so we're hoping that there's some questions that you might want her to expound upon. Let me also quickly acknowledge our partner campuses who are joining us in their various sites as well. And so thank you to Broward and the Davie campus. Thank you to Jupiter and the Student Affairs staff there for organizing their campuses and making this happen, not just here in Boca or Palm Beach, but we are going to go out and impact South Broward as well as here in Central, and then certainly in the northern part in Jupiter as well. So FAU, you're doing an awesome job on today. And with that, are there any questions that you would have? Not everybody talk at once. Let me say that, yes, ma'am.
I have a question as far as, sorry, my name's Amanda Evans. And I have a question as far as for your last point. Do you think there's a difference in the idea of equality and equity when moving forward into the idea of balancing that racial scale? Sure. Or income?
Absolutely. The question was, is there a difference between equality and equity? And I definitely think there is. I think for a long time, so much of the way we focused has been on equality. I think especially about school desegregation. It was making sure that Black kids had the same access, had the same materials that white kids did when they went to school, because our schools have historically been underfunded. But equality doesn't solve the problems of history. And we tend in our culture to be ahistorical. That's just a part of kind of American ingenuity. We're always thinking about what's next. We don't want to think about the past. But when it comes to race, and in particular lack of opportunity because of race, you have to talk about those accumulated effects over time. And simply lowering the boundary is not going to make it right. Malcolm X famously said, you know, you just can't have stabbed me and take the knife out and tell me to move on with my life. Where is the healing? Where is the effort to make a person whole? And so when we talk about equity, it really and truly is that. It has to have some consideration for past harm and trying to make that up. It has to take consideration that not everyone has the same starting point. And that really and truly is a necessary complication to the way that we understand the work that needs to be done.
Other questions? Dr. Hodge, will you talk a little bit about the importance of intersectionality in this work, meaning whether it's being multiracial, whether it's coming across the lines in terms of sexuality, and so any of the identities. But as we think about Dr. King and certainly the multiracial movement that he was able to organize, as we think about 2020 and beyond, what's the important value of the intersectionality among the various identities in the room as we look to start our own movement?
Sure. Shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw, Black woman, who gave us the framework of intersectionality. And what she is calling forward with that idea is that there can be multiple points of disadvantage and exclusion that we have to consider. For example, myself and a white woman, yes, we have in common the fact that we are women, and in this society, in the social construct, we may experience similar types of oppression because we are women, but I have the additional burden of navigating as a Black woman that also has to deal with racism. And so there is a different look to what that feels like and the problems that I'm going to encounter. I will have to say that my work with South Florida people of color and really thinking more critically about the activism around how we move forward and including people and dealing with bias has helped me in my own understanding of LGBTQ issues. Because when you really put freedom for everyone at the top of the list, you gotta allow people to be who they are and not to judge them and to give them opportunity to define themselves for who they are. And so I think that as we deal with all of these issues, we can see that the needle is moving in a very positive direction as we begin to, and I'm very adamant about this as a historian, that is my training. I think there is so much good knowledge, especially in social science and history, that tends to stay trapped in the university, that we really need to get out to the streets and help people to understand, because concepts like intersectionality, the things that we're learning about even race, and there's a whole field of whiteness studies that I think is absolutely brilliant for helping us to understand whiteness as a social construct, something that's not biologically defined. So I think that not only with intersectionality, there's just so much that can help us to advance, so we all can get free. That's the goal.
Yes, ma'am. Hi, my name is Joy Kendrick, and I also had a quick question because you briefly mentioned about how we need to get out and speak more of that information and the awareness of like the different things that I'm still learning about. What do you think are the things that are kind of like hindering that process to actually begin? Because I do feel like there is somewhat of a halt in that process of like those movements that, you know, Martin Luther King went through, or, you know, just other kind of things that we've also took like in all through history. So what do you think are those things that are causing that little slow movement to go?
Yeah, I think with, you know, I've been in higher education for some years. It's my favorite space to be. I love the intellectual life. I love learning. I love teaching. I feel a real honor being able now to be an administrator at Florida Memorial University. But the nature of colleges and college education is that we tend to talk to each other. But there's so much about what we are learning that can help other people. And I think, you know, my piece of it has been through this group that I mentioned, South Florida People of Color. I started with them. They asked me to come and facilitate a book discussion in the community. And what I witnessed was a real hunger, in particular on the part of white people, to understand more about African American history. I got into Black history to teach Black people Black history. That was my goal. But I realized that there was a need to teach people who didn't look like me about what we call a communiversity, that we take what we have on these walls and in these silos out and into the streets. The other hurdle I would say that I see is there, you all are vastly distracted by social media, right? And it's just a tool. It's just a tool, and we can either use it for good or for not. And we love to take really pretty pictures and videos and posts, but even in the context of preparing my speech today, I often think about what would the Montgomery bus boycott have been like if Joanne Robinson had access to Twitter as opposed to the mimeograph machine she had to run all night to get the word out, right? You have all of these incredible tools to foment whatever you would like to foment, whatever your passion is, whatever need you see in the world. It's even easier for you to go about it today, but I just don't think we have the sustained focus and passion to be able to do it. And I also don't think it's an accident. When we look at the chronic underfunding of education, chronic underfunding of even higher education in this country over the years, it's brought us to a point where not a whole lot of people have the raw tools for critical thinking and analysis, and there are folks who are positioned to take advantage of that. And so I think we have to always keep that in front of us, not be distracted, having fun. I like having fun too. I missed some great parties last night because I had to be here at 8 in the morning. So you did too. Or maybe you did and you slept it off. But there has to be a balance between those two things. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. My name is Marla Rodriguez. As a Black woman, I find myself struggling sometimes to create a space for myself in my career when there's just like a lot of white spaces for me. So how was it in your journey and in your career creating a space for yourself? Did you find that you had to be the first to do it and, you know, teach everyone around you basically that Black people exist outside of their ideas of Black people?
That is a very interesting question. Her question has to do with finding a space as a Black woman in a society that still, unfortunately, has a tendency to marginalize you or exoticize you. And it's actually in conversation in the last few years that I realized that historically Black colleges and universities have become my safe space. It started for me leaving high school. I attended a high school in Suwannee County, small rural community in North Florida. But my experiences there really brought race to my consciousness in a negative way. And so when I was making the decision about where I would attend college, I deliberately chose an HBCU. And I found at Florida A&M in Tallahassee a place that was affirming of my identity in ways that had not been before. And I, you know, for all the challenges that I had there, I knew that whatever came my way, whatever didn't go my way, wouldn't be because I was Black, right? And that for me was very comforting. And since that time, I have continued to, you know, I may leave, but I always end up at an HBCU. I left Florida Memorial for a year and went to work at a PWI last year and came right back. Because there was nothing, I mean, I have to say in my adult life, there was nothing as crystallizing as being a Black woman, you know, leader in a predominantly white space that crystallized the inequality and how painful that was for me. So I don't think it's, maybe it is a retreat. I don't know, but I kind of take it as the other side. I believe in HBCUs. I believe that they're the places that are perpetuating Black culture, they're culture keepers, they're preparing the next generations of African Americans, students sometimes that get left behind, and it's incredibly valuable work. Florida Memorial is 141 years old this year, so I take pride in that tradition and being a part of helping to move it forward. But fight for that. It is vital. But also remember to find a place that's safe for you too.
Yeah.
Dr. Hobbs, on behalf, we want to thank you. On behalf of our university and certainly the Division of Student Affairs and Enrollment Management, and Dr. Larry Furman, Dr. Where is she? Oh, she's over there? Okay, all right. And so our Vice President for Diversity Outreach, we want to thank you for being here today. Here's a small token of our appreciation
Thank you very much.
for you. And And so once again, can we just applaud? So this brings us to a close of our diversity address for starting out our day. We want to now begin to transition into finalizing the registration and getting you all off on to your sites. And so again, we want to thank our collaborators today that came together to put on this event for today. We want to thank all of you for being here and for what you will do throughout the rest of the day for our communities. I want to thank my I guess co-collaborator, if you will, but Ms. Lindsay Goldstein for being every step of the way, and we've had some conversations. Lindsay is new to the university, and so we've kind of been in the trenches together trying to figure this out. And so thank you to Lindsay, and at this time we want to bring her up as we get ready to transition. I also want to one more time bring to your attention again Social Justice Week again on your tables. We're hoping that you'll take a picture of that. Some awesome events that will take place throughout the rest of the week. And the one that I want to really highlight at the end of the week is We Lead on Saturday. And so where you can, as Dr. Hobbs mentioned, you can come and get more of that education around equity, diversity, inclusion, and more takeaways. But please, if you haven't registered for We Lead, we ask that you do so by Thursday. Registration will close on this Thursday. And so we have some powerful keynotes coming in for that particular presentation. And we also have some great breakout sessions. Again, you won't be sorry that you chose to attend. With that being said, I want to hand off to Lindsay, and she'll lead us in our transition. Thank you all so much again.
Thank you so much, David. So before we go into our day of service part, I do also want to kind of